Okay, welcome guys. This is going to be part 2 or part B of this little expose into the NASA worm logo, which they've just brought back out for this recent launch of the new SpaceX rocket that NASA is now commissioning. So this is the first big thing that NASA has done with their commercialization of space, which is a really historic time, and they're bringing back this logo back from the 1970s that they actually fell into disuse back in the 1990s. They're now bringing it back out, and I think it's a great move. It's such a nice logo in comparison to the old meatball logo, which we had a bit of a look at. I'll just zoom through to where we are currently. All right, so here we are, the logo typing correct uses. So the logo type is designed as solid stroke letter forms to be used freestanding horizontal against a solid neutral background. The logo type must not be altered or distorted in any way. And so it's showing sorts of distortions that you just wouldn't do today. This one certainly you wouldn't do today. But you know, like if they were showing it today, quite often what they would show is actually just using like compressing the logo or getting the aspect ratio wrong, because that's the most common thing in the digital era. When you put a logo somewhere, if you don't actually constrain it to its direct proportions, you end up with like a slightly squashed logo or a stretched logo or whatever else it might actually be. And so in this case, what they don't have to worry about that, because everything is done photographically. I mean, they've done it sort of. If we have a bit of a look, so must not be altered. The example shown below illustrates. So one, the letter form in the logo type must never be broken by a superimposed pattern. I guess you could do that. What would tend to happen nowadays is this sort of logo would be used, and probably you get away with it. It actually look fairly good to actually be able to use this logo with a different sort of treatment over a graphic. It would actually work in really quite nicely. But in this era, that was a big no-no to actually do that, and that's mainly because of the technology again, that the limits of the technology and the way that you would then have to reproduce things with the technology. So the logo type must never be placed within another solid shape, such as a circle. This is sort of stuff that, again, today you would probably do it because, but in this instance, they were very, trying to constrain the use so that it was really strict usage. And the more strict the usage is, quite often the better the result is. I've worked with some style guides with different sorts of companies where it's been ridiculously bad that you can't even communicate, you can't use it as a communication device. Whereas I've worked with other ones with very strict guidelines that just, like they guide you into the best way of communicating with their brand, and this is more in that sort of latter category. Like for example, the Hyatt Resorts, for example, had a really excellent style guide from the 1990s it's probably the best style guide I've ever seen, and I loved working with it. It was, I don't know how many pages it was. It was really thick, really massive book, and it was and the guidelines in that were very strict. But they just worked. And then since then, I've worked with other resorts and other sorts of companies where they've had style guides that have been just as big but really bad. But this one here is pretty good. Okay, so the circular logo type must never be placed within another outline shape, such as a box. So even with that, it's sort of saying, no, you can't do that, because it takes away from what you're looking at. The whole idea of this is to keep it nice and simple and airy, and allow it to sort of work on its own. As soon as you start to do this sort of stuff and this sort of stuff, you're changing the actual graphic message of what's being presented. You're changing the communication. You're putting constraints on these upward movements, these upward arrows with the A's. And so again, it's just interesting that the way that they've sort of done this. 4, the logo type must never be shown in outlined forms. This is an unusual one, because this is something that I bet you we start to see this. I bet you we start to see this a lot if they bring this logo back in. Again, technology-wise, this is a very easy thing for us to do. It was even easy back then, actually, photographically. You could actually do this using like bromide cameras and things to actually get an outline result fairly easily, just with just using photographic techniques. So even on computers, this is really easy, of course, nowadays. The logo type should never be shown with shadows projected from the letter forms, or the letter forms partially outlined. This was so common in the 1970s. This is sort of such a reflection of the times. We still see it today, but back in the 1970s, everything was done this way. In the late 1960s, and through the 1970s, this is really a style from that era. It's really funny to sort of to see the way that they had to say, look, stop doing what you think is cool, because this is not what we want to have happen with our logo. Again, it changes the communication of the actual logo itself. Now, of course, skewing it. So how do they term the number 6? The logo type should never be photographically distorted in any way. Okay, so they've actually, nowadays what we'd call this would be skew or italicizing, because we can do this so simply in the computers. To do this in a camera, like in a bromide camera sort of situation, you'd have to actually angle the baseboard for when you actually are photographing it, to sort of get this sort of effect. Again, it was something that took a bit of skill to do this. Like you'd have to sort of do it in a certain way, but you had no way of really strictly constraining it unless you did it by hand. You'd either sort of do it by hand, but you can see that by doing this, they're now getting thicker areas in through here, thinner areas in through here. They wouldn't want to do it anyway, because it does change things, but it's just interesting. The technology, again, is very, very different in this era than in our current digital era. Okay, then we've got should never be shown in a light Ben-Day screen. I've never heard of that term before. Against a white background, and there's probably a better way of actually seeing that one. I don't know what a Ben-Day screen is. That may even be the stippling that we sort of see, that was used in this era. Against a white background, it should always be shown in solid black, solid warm grey, or solid NASA red. The logo type should never be shown in a Ben-Day screen of a dark background colour. It should always appear in white. So if it's in this case, it should always be in white. And the last one through here, the logo type should never be shown on a vertical axis. It is designed to rest on its horizontal baseline. And so, again, the horizontal baseline is important. And that sort of makes me think that was probably the reason for this little sharp corner here, which then sort of meant that we've got sharp corners here, and across the base, just so that the upward movement of the two A's sort of is more prevalent. I'm guessing that would, and I'm just guessing this, of course, but that's sort of what I would imagine would have been the reasoning for not actually just going fully circular. In this era, having the circularized shapes would have been something that would have really fitted in with the 1970s. That would have been something that would have been done, pretty much. They would have done that back in that particular time frame. Go to the next one through here. Now this is interesting. This is actually, people don't do this much anymore, but this is still something I think is really, really valuable when you're doing letter forms. They do it a little bit differently. I mean, I wouldn't do it on a grid as such anymore, because this was actually mainly done for sign writers. So the NASA logo type should be reproduced photographically whenever possible. So by photographically, it means doing it through bromide cameras, which was a very large reproduction camera where you'd actually have sheets of film on top. You'd have like a massive bellows with a camera underneath it that would then sort of photograph whatever your artwork was underneath this side. So it's saying whatever possible, do it that way, because you're not going to get any distortion or anything sort of different actually happening with the actual logo itself. However, for large applications such as signage, the logo may be reproduced using the grid drawing as an accurate guide. To achieve the best reproduction, care should be taken to maintain the correct proportion, stroke width and curves of the logo. Note that the 3 units of the grid are equal to the vertical stroke width. So they've used, even this one here, they've gone slightly off. They haven't tried to constrain it to the actual grid line itself. I would bet almost anything that if this was actually done today, these lines would all be conforming to the actual grid line itself. They would just be changed subtly. The N is quite wide in comparison to the other letters, and could have been changed a little bit to just reduce this curve ever so slightly to get that to go exactly. Again, in the digital world, it's easy to do that. Back in here, they probably didn't design the logo with a grid in mind. They certainly would have been using rulers and things. In fact, you can see there's a little bit of white under there. I don't know if that's something where this thing hasn't quite worked. You can see it's slightly over the top of the line through here. The S is even slightly over as well by the looks of things. This one sits right on the back edge of it. That would be a fold mark through there, I would think. So we wouldn't have to sort of see anything else in through there. But this was often, like sign writers and mural painters and things used to actually sort of use grid systems and reproduce all their artwork and stuff with a grid system if they were sort of projecting this onto a large surface, just so they could get it exactly right for when they actually did the hand painting. Yep, so there we go. We just keep it. It's interesting again to sort of see this because you don't see grid systems anymore. Now you see units, and what they would have done with this one is said 1 unit is the width of the vertical stroke, and so it would have been, and everything would have been sort of to say. Even this one, you can see that they've actually got 3 units on the outside edge that say, okay, 1 graphic unit in is a minimum, 3 graphics from the top, or it might be sort of like 3 1/3. They may even say that 1 unit is 1/3 of the stroke, and then gone in actual units that way. So quite often now we use graphic units, and even in the 1980s, 10 years after that, graphic units were sort of more the way that you would communicate the way that the logo then had to sit within certain areas. Whereas in this era, it was I guess the grid would have been the only other way that the logo would have been reproduced. Anyway, it's just interesting again to sort of see the histories of these sorts of things. Okay, mission patches and other symbols. We won't go into this one sort of too much. Okay, actually, we'll just read this one though. Part of the tradition of NASA revolves around the pride taken in the accomplishments of various individual projects or missions. One mode of expression of this pride has been the mission patch. Because of the relatively short duration of any specific mission, and because of the unique personality of each of the patches, they should occupy their own visual space, separated from official NASA identification. In this way, the two elements non-competitive, and the mission patch can achieve the emphasis it deserves. Contact the graphics coordinator, blah, blah, blah. And so in through here, again, we're sort of seeing different sorts of approaches with the graphic treatment. We're seeing different fonts back in use through here. It's been hard to sort of see what's going on through this one. But again, it's really is just about, this is the one where the missions are given the, if you saw part A, we're talking a little bit at the start about the graphic communication, where there would have been people advocating for this sort of treatment for the actual logo, and it's really impressive that they basically said no, this has to be as simple as possible. Yet they have given this creative outlet for the individual missions, which is really, really cool. I think this is great, actually, the way they've actually done this. So anyway, that's just the actual missions themselves of the course. At this stage, Apollo 11 would have been the flagship of everything that they've really achieved. They've had a few other lunar missions since that time, but Apollo 11 was the crowning glory. Okay, back in through here, the NASA seal. This is interesting. We had a look at this one just before. I'll go back to the original, so you can sort of, not the original, one that they're currently using now. This almost works better than the one that they currently use. Although this one's got problems as well. Look at the space in here as opposed to here, and the space here as opposed to here as well. This is really, actually, this is crap. This is really bad. Massive space in through here. This reminds me of the bosses I used to have back in this era. Was if you did that, they'd be saying you could drive a truck through that. And you'd have to then redo this, and so this would have, at this stage, this would have all been done by hand, as in even if you had sort of like letter-set lettering, where you'd actually sort of be able to have like rub-down lettering, you'd still have to actually sort of plan it by hand and get it right, and so it really doesn't, it's not even leveled. It actually doesn't work. This is actually really crappy. But if you ever look at the current one, which is done digitally, it's actually, the font choice is bad. Everything else is bad about that as well. Yeah, this is what I mean. This one here, it's got, like, one's been done digitally, but it's it's even this one. Like, I mean, I guess it does sort of line up through here. You can see the spacing is a little bit better in through this side, but it's but again, the kerning. The actual individual kerning of the lettering is really terrible. For something that's actually like their actual brand, their seal, it's a really poor version. Plus, using the font choice that they've actually gone with, and moving away from the font choices of the actual space administration, like everything else that they've ever done, is. Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking when they did this one, but this is their actual site, by the way. So this is the official one that they currently have of that old version. The NASA seal is used for formal agency events, but again, really, really poor representation of the actual way it was done, with the kerning between the lettering. Just no thought, no process put into this at all. Yeah, very, very interesting. Very, very interesting to sort of see the back in the era before they could do things digitally, they had to do it all by hand, and it was still pretty crap. They didn't really care much when they built the first one, but then when they've done this as well, the people who put this together, again, it's a pretty poor result, really, with what they've actually done. If they've, the fact that they've actually changed it as well. In fact, it even looks to me like there's more space here. I don't know if we can get a blown up version of this. It looks like there's more space in through here than there is in through the top. It's just a bad representation for something that's so important. Yeah, this looks wider here than in here. Yeah, this doesn't look good. It's just a very, very poor, very poor result, really, for what they could have done. Yeah, even the spacing in through this side. At least the other one put extra spacing to sort of keep the USA separate, but even that doesn't look like it's actually centered. Like the center line for me would be through the back end of the S. It's just big problems. Even if something that's recent. And this is what I mean. Like the skill levels certainly dropped a lot in the like, and I don't know when this was done, but the skill levels when digital came in, people stopped seeing these sorts of little issues that that you used to have to finesse. Like you spend hours and hours doing it by hand, and now suddenly you had computers that could do it like in a couple of seconds, and all of the actual the art of it, and I guess the technical expertise of it actually sort of dropped out at that point in time. I know I'm ranting about that, but it's something that used to drive me nuts when I used to sort of see what would happen with digital, with the way that digital actually sort of came in and really corrupted the actual skills of what people actually had back in before the people with digital skills. Yeah, I was right on that cusp of coming in when I learnt before digital and then came into the workforce as digital came into the workforce as well. And so it was actually, for me, it was a really interesting time. Yeah, and so here we are again. We're back with this same sort of shape. You can see the centering is off. Now that could be that it's just supposed to be back around the other way, because it looks like the horizontal of this one looks like it's crooked. So that one looks like it should be rotated. I'm sort of doing it with my hands, but it should be rotated this way just slightly to actually get the correct version. Now that may be the scanning. I don't think it would be that much, though. It looks fairly dramatic. It looks like a couple of degrees off. So the NASA seal reflects the history. Actually, I'll just go and do this one in presentation mode. Here we go. So NASA seal reflects the history and tradition of the agency and has a definite role to play in certain visual communications. Well, it's funny because this is quite often you get this where there's a historic bent back to one of the early logos that a lot of old timers in different companies will adhere to through thick and thin. They will not sort of bend. It's set in stone. It's what they need to actually have, and it's still so prevalent. Actually, even the shapes here, you can definitely see this one's actually been placed not on the horizontal, which is quite funny because this one really, in a style menu, that should have been done that way. Okay, so while the NASA logotype is used in all of the agency's day-to-day communication material, the seal should be reserved for use in connection with award presentations or formal events and activities which are ceremonial or traditional in nature. The seal should never be used along with the NASA logotype. The two elements are intended for different purposes and are visually incompatible when seen side by side, which they certainly are. Contact the NASA, once again, just contacting their coordinator to actually make sure that is sort of used in the correct way. And this is still quite often, like you tend to now get like having the ability to actually override the people who would want to keep these old versions, but I still actually have clients that cannot shake their adherence to an old logo, even though that they need the new logo for their marketing and branding. They'll still use the old logo for official documentation. It's really quite funny because it's usually not a good idea, but it still happens even today. And I'm thinking of a number of clients where that actually is very, very prevalent, like with people that I actually deal with. Where from a marketing perspective, they will use the new branding and the new look because it actually conforms to everything that needs to be communicated. But for anything that goes back where they're dealing with old timers, with people who sort of knew the organisation for a length of time, they will tend to go back to, unfortunately, the old logo. It's funny. It's a funny world. Okay, let's continue on. So reproduction. So this page contains camera ready, meaning this is the bromide cameras I was talking about before. Reproduction artwork of the NASA logotype. This artwork may be reduced or enlarged photographically. And so this would then be how you would then sort of do things. In fact, this one, I think that's little glitch in there would have been. This is the sort of glitch you can get if you reproduce things poorly on a bromide camera. If you have things slightly out of focus, it would still go back to like posterization where it would actually end up with crisp edges photographically. But if you had any sort of blurring at all in the like if you didn't have everything 100% in focus, this was like an indication of something where it may have risen a little bit if that was the case. But I'm thinking this would be part of the scanning process, like when this would have been scanned. The scanning in this one doesn't look all that good anyway, to be honest. So this is not a representation. Like nowadays, if we were getting PDF artwork, it wouldn't be of a scan. It would actually be of actual artwork that was done digitally, whereas this, of course, wasn't done digitally. But anyway, that's just an interesting little glitch. Often you'd see that if you had even just something slightly out of focus, that would be an indication of what you'd get there. You get little rounded corners as well, usually if that was the case. Anyway, that's the logo type. So that was used for the bromide cameras. It's interesting for me even just to sort of see the gap through here is quite thin, whereas they actually didn't. Like if they've actually got more gap on this side, they didn't actually even position that as well as what you would see nowadays. Like it's like that would have actually been done differently. Like if that was actually being sort of visually centered now, you'd cut through a little bit of the extra, so you'd actually be more. This would be more over this side with actually a bit more of a gap over this side. It wouldn't be centered directly from that point to this point either. It would actually be, this one would be slightly over. Anyway, like the way that this loop drops underneath the gap. So that's actually sort of one of those little sorts of things that we see there through there. Okay, so reproduction art. This is actually using the National Aeronautics and Space Administration lettering, and this is also why they have gone and used so they've still actually anchored it on the left-hand side and ranging it from the right. And so they've got it sort of where I think that, I don't know, one thing I'm not sure about is why they put administration down below. When they've got administration basically lining up with the A, it looks like it may be just slightly off, but that for me would have been, the space administration word for me would have been the overriding aspect. So personally, what I would have done is have administration still out through here, because the National Aeronautics and would have still given a nice shape coming down to form the box. Whereas in this case, they just really do have it sort of centering off on the left-hand side. I think they're trying to get like a vertical representation. But one thing they have tried to keep consistent is they've tried to keep this lettering dimension consistent with in both instances, so it's the same type size, whether it be sort of more the horizontal version. Another interesting thing with that as well would be that you'd almost be wanting to try to get, if you could do it, if you brought the administration up through there, it may even have been better to actually have the 3 lines and somehow get them to fit in through there. If you could do that as well, you'd be looking for little graphic ways of getting like a wide version, a tall version, but anyway, they've got the 2 different versions through here. But that's for me is sort of like a weird design choice. I don't actually understand why they didn't actually go and complete the grid by putting administration and keeping administration like what they've done through here. Anyway, it's just, for me, it's just interesting. This page contains camera-ready artwork, again, blah, blah, blah. So this one can then be used in whatever application they actually sort of need to make use of it. Continue on, reproduction art. So this, they've then got the different sorts of information from the space centers and things. They've then got the, this typeface actually looks like it's actually bigger than this one anyway. Actually, we were looking at this before and thought that this one looks smaller, but this one actually looks bigger. Yeah, this for me looks like it's hasn't been specified correctly, because this wouldn't have been set in the computer, remember. This would have been actually either done photographically, which is probably the way they did do it ultimately, or it would have been typeset, in which case it would have had to specify exactly what it was. In fact, this would have been done photographically even if this was typeset. I'm guessing that this would have been typeset, actually. So this aspect, this one would have been done with bromide cameras. Anyway, that's that one, reproduction seal. So we can see through here, actually see how this one doesn't actually conform. This one is off. For horizontal alignment, trim away before reproduction. So this is their horizontal alignment, which actually means that this one's slightly got an angle up. The actual aspect of this one is going through here. This looks like it's wrong to me. I can see even the shape of the stars are actually pointing off at an angle. It's not. Yeah, I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. I would almost bet if I was a designer of this one, it'd be no, it's supposed to be 3 degrees down this way. Just make it go clockwise, 3 degrees or 2 degrees or something, just to get that the USA centered underneath. Anyway, just interesting to sort of see what they did back through here. I would love to know why that wasn't picked up, or if it is correct, why they would have it skewed like off on a slight rotation like this. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't look right. Definitely doesn't look right. Anyway, we'll continue on. Here we go with the actual swatches that can then be taken out of the actual kit itself. And so these would then be sort of torn out of the actual kit that you had. These would be perforated. And so you then tear out the swatches, and these would be spot color printed. And so it nowhere in here does it talk about about paint colours. It doesn't talk about Pantone printing colours, which is now the standard. And it became the standard probably, I'd say, within 5 years of this document being done. So it's sort of interesting that they weren't using it, even though the rest of the world was starting to use it at that stage. So the NASA Red now, I think, is PMS 185 from other things that I've actually sort of seen. And this one does look, even though it's hard to sort of tell from here, but this sort of a fire engine red is actually a warmer red, is a sort of hotter red, whereas this red here is about as deep a red as you're going to get, and 185 does tend to be this sort of red. And so anyway, I'm guessing that that's what that would have been if they were trying to specify it. But in this case, they just matched up. They mixed their own red, and that was what they went with. And so this would have been a printing colour, and they would have just given it to everybody. All the printers, like if you were specifying a job, they would have torn out one of the swatches. Here's your red. You gave them the information. This swatch is to be used in achieving a visual match in any medium of reproduction, including inks, paints, dyes, or other pigments, when NASA Red is specified. And so whether you're a sign writer, which would have been a common thing for them to use, a printer doing spot colour, because back then the inks that were then used, and still nowadays it's the same thing, you would actually then, you still have to colour match and actually sort of visually get a colour representation of a swatch that you're trying to sort of match. And so now we've actually got like formula books and things like that for their printing processes. Back then it was a real art again to sort of get exactly the right colour. And a printer, and my father-in-law was a printer, and so the skill level that he had to have to be able to sort of match the colours was something that was really, really valued back in those early, like in the 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s. Even the 90s, it was all still done where that skill level was really high, and then it became digital. And then from there, it was still important to try to get the matching, but it was then done in a completely different way, completely different process. Anyway, we'll continue on. We then have the different sort of examples. I might sort of race forward and just get this thing finished, because these examples, I guess that like we'd still see these sorts of things done today. What's interesting to me is just how close they are to the edge. Like nowadays, you wouldn't see it anywhere near that close. And even back in this era, I'm surprised it would have been that close. That's sort of surprising. Back in through here with envelopes, that was about right. You actually had an actual dimension that you had to conform to with your envelopes, and that, certainly in the 1980s and 90s, that was the case, and you really couldn't deviate from that. So you had to sort of you were stuck doing certain things at a certain size. They had to have certain sorts of information on them, and it would then go from there. And even this, you could only go a certain distance across. I don't think it's like, people don't do envelopes anymore, but it used to be very, very prevalent to actually have printed envelopes. Like you hardly see them around anymore because of, like, you've now got window envelopes and things like that. But anyway, it's, in fact, most people don't even send letters anymore. But in this case, it was actually very, very important to actually have it done a certain way. But the letterheads, again, this would have been done for typewriters. So this is well before you've got computers. You could have still actually had computerized information, but then would have been put out onto an actual typewriter itself. Will we have to go to a third one? If you probably will. So maybe I do just go a little bit sort of slowly through these examples. There's centre letterheads and envelopes. So this is for the actual centres themselves. Don't know why that's in black. That's interesting. Yeah, it's telling you, actually, here's the specification. Actually, I might leave this for the next one as well. I'll make us a version C, and we'll then start to talk about the actual typography, because that's the next thing I think we've got coming up, will be the typography. Oh, here we go. They've actually now got the, they've used this to actually, they have inset this. Okay, all right. We'll come back with episode C of this little expose into the style manual of the worm logo for NASA, and talk more about the typography and the history of the type that they've used, why it was used in certain ways, and what we would do nowadays with it. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you then.